Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, articles, research, maybe your own notes, and really pull out the most important bits of knowledge or insight. Think of it as your shortcut to getting genuinely informed. We aim for surprising facts, maybe a little humor too. Today, we're embarking on a pretty deep dive into something that shapes, well, everything. Our societies, how we see each other, even what we think it means to be human. We're talking about the concept of human disability. Our mission here is to unpack what disability actually means, beyond the surface level, how its definition shapes society, and maybe how we can build a more inclusive future. Get ready for some surprising facts that might challenge some common assumptions.
Indeed. And what's really fascinating looking through these sources is that human disability, it isn't some fixed objective thing, not at all. Instead, it's a contested space. Yeah. Its meaning is shaped by these powerful ideas, these theoretical frameworks that have really evolved over time, historically and philosophically.
Okay, so when you hear the word disability, what immediately comes to mind for you? I think for a lot of us, there's a pretty ingrained idea. But our sources show us this concept is, well, far from universal. But let's start unpacking this. The first major framework, the medical model. This model, which really dominated Western thought for centuries, it views disability as a defect, right? An aberration, maybe even a personal tragedy that lives inside the individual's body. It pops up around the 1800s, framing disability basically as a medical problem, something to be fixed or cured, even if there's no actual pain or illness involved.
Yeah, and the consequences of thinking that way are profound. It really fosters low expectations. It focuses almost entirely on what a person cannot do. The language associated with it often includes terms we now find quite pejorative, like handicapped, cripple, suffering from, or wheelchair-bound. It reinforces these negative, sometimes charitable, views. And legally, you see this embedded in frameworks like the U.S. Social Security Administration's definition. It requires a medically determinable physical or mental impairment, verifiable by clinical techniques. So it just reduces this whole complex human experience down to a biomedical problem, which is quite something when you think about it.
Right. And then, maybe predictably, a really radical departure from this view came along. It came from disabled people themselves, mostly in the latter half of the 20th century. This leads us to the social model. And the really revolutionary thing this framework did was make a very clear distinction between impairment and disability. That separation is key.
Exactly. An impairment, in this view, is defined as a long-term limitation of someone's function, like maybe being unable to see or walk. But disability, this is the crucial part. Disability is not the impairment itself. It's the disadvantage, the restriction of activity caused by a society that's organized without really considering people with impairments. So the takeaway is people aren't disabled by their bodies. They're disabled by societal barriers. Societal barriers, yeah. What kind of things does that include? Oh, they're multifaceted. You got physical barriers, buildings with steps but no ramps, that sort of thing. Then there are attitudinal barriers, prejudice, stereotypes. We often call this disableism or ableism now. Institutional barriers, too, like discriminatory laws or policies. And communication barriers. Maybe information isn't available in accessible formats like Braille or large print. So from the social model perspective, the solution isn't fixing the person. It's dismantling these barriers. It reframes disability as a political issue, an issue of oppression and civil rights, kind of like racism or sexism.
That's a huge shift in thinking. It totally changes where the responsibility lies, doesn't it? And it shifts agency, I guess, from doctors to disabled people themselves, recognizing them as the real experts on their own lives.
Precisely.
But as usual, the conversation didn't end there. There was an attempt to sort of reconcile these two very different views, which led to the biopsychosocial model.
Right. This model has been pretty influential, especially with the World Health Organization's classification system. It basically suggests that disability comes from a complex interaction between three things, all interconnected. There's biology, the health condition itself, psychology, personal factors like how someone copes, their self-esteem, and social, those environmental and societal factors we just talked about. So it offers a more maybe holistic view. It acknowledges the reality of impairment and medicine's role, but it still includes the social model's point that society is crucial. Although, it's worth noting, some scholars argue it can still end up recentering medical authority a bit too much. It's a tricky balance.
And pushing even further beyond that, our sources reveal the affirmation model. This one frames disability actually as a positive identity, which might sound surprising to some.
Yes, this model came directly from within the disability community. It's a powerful rejection of that old tragedy narrative. It actively highlights the benefits of being disabled. It frames disability as a positive source of identity, community, pride. Think about cultural movements like deaf gain. It reframes hearing loss not as a loss, but as gaining entry into a vibrant deaf culture with its own language, its own traditions. Or the neurodiversity movement. It sees neurological variations like autism or ADHD not as deficits, but as valuable parts of human diversity. Focusing on differences, not deficits. The goal is really about fostering positive self-image and pride.
Wow, that's quite an evolution. From the medical view of disability as a problem, all the way to affirming it as a source of pride. It's a profound shift in power and perspective. But you can't really understand disability without looking at its counterpart, normalcy. Our sources explain that normalcy isn't fixed or inherent, it's socially constructed, what we consider typical or acceptable. That's defined by social norms, which are fluid and passed down through family, school, media.
Exactly, and this construction process has huge implications because when you establish a standard of normal, you automatically, sometimes unintentionally, create the category of abnormal or deviant. And that abnormal category often gets coded as undesirable, even pathological. It creates this immense pressure for everyone to conform.
This sounds a lot like the work of Michel Foucault. He talked about how modern power works, didn't he? Not always through force, but through knowledge and norms that regulate people. Disciplinary power, he called it.
Precisely. In his lectures, Abnormal, Foucault tracks how this figure of the abnormal individual really emerged in the 19th century as something for medicine and law to manage. He saw it as a mix of older figures like the human monster, the person needing correction, even the onanist. Psychiatry gained its authority partly by identifying and managing these supposedly dangerous individuals. For Foucault, the norm isn't just neutral. He said it's an element on the basis of which a certain exercise of power is founded and legitimized. So defining normal is an act of power. It actively creates the abnormal.
And the 19th century provided a tool that made this seem objective, statistics, which led to what some call the tyranny of the average.
Absolutely. Early sociologists like Emil Durkheim argue that common behaviors were normal and exceptions were pathological. This led to visualizing normalcy with the bell curve, right? Where normal is the peak, the average, and statistically rare traits at the edges become abnormal, like having an IQ score below 70. The problem is this gives a sort of scientific gloss to social judgments, and the consequence. Society, our buildings, our schools, our expectations gets built for this imaginary average person, and that inherently constructs disability. When stairs are the only option, the person using a wheelchair becomes disabled by the stairs, not just by their legs. Medicalizing disability fits right in here. Human variation gets reframed as a pathology that experts need to normalize. It depoliticizes difference, makes it an individual issue.
This deep dive into definitions really shows how much words matter. And their history, especially around disability, is often, well, pretty dark. The way terms have changed really maps onto shifting attitudes. Like in the 19th century, affliction was common, rooted in a kind of Christian worldview, seeing disability as a spiritual burden from God, maybe. Then, with the industrial age, you get handicapped, implying someone's held back in the race for life. We now see that as quite pejorative and disabled itself. It dates back to the 1570s. Historically, it was a really broad negative label for any group seen as failing society's norms. The core, criminals, not just people with impairments, shows how language lumped people together.
It really does. And this leads us into a truly chilling part of the history, the eugenics movement. This, in many ways, is the most frightening logical conclusion if you take the medical model's core idea that disability is an undesirable biological defect to its extreme. Francis Galton coined eugenics in 1883. It literally means well-born. It twisted ideas from Darwin and Mendel to justify controlling human reproduction, aiming to eliminate undesirable traits. And the IQ test, initially meant to help kids in school, was horribly co-opted by eugenicists like H.H. Goddard. They used it to label people as feeble-minded, a vague category that included not just intellectual disabilities, but also the poor immigrants people deemed immoral.
It's awful to think about. How did this ideology translate into actual policy? What happened?
Well, in the U.S., it led to things like harsh immigration restrictions, screening people based on perceived fitness, and most infamously, forced sterilization laws. Indiana passed the world's first eugenic sterilization law in 1907. 24 other states followed suit. And this wasn't some fringe idea. It was endorsed by the U.S. Supreme Court. The 1927 Buck v. Bell decision. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote, "It is better for all the world if society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That's terrific. And disturbingly, this American eugenics movement directly inspired Nazi Germany. Their T4 mercy killing program systematically murdered between 75,000 and 250,000 disabled people. This history is a stark reminder. It shows the terrifyingly direct path from seeing disability as just a biological flaw to justifying the most extreme human rights violations.
That is incredibly sobering, a really dark chapter. But thankfully, against that backdrop, a powerful counter-movement emerged. The disability rights movement.
Yeah.
This wasn't just asking for kindness. It was a fundamental political and philosophical revolution driven by disabled people themselves.
Exactly. It was a complete rejection of those charity and medical models that treated disabled people as pitiable objects or patients needing cures. Instead, they demanded a civil rights framework. They asserted the main problems weren't their bodies, but discrimination and societal barriers. And this shift was fueled by direct action, by protest, like the famous 1977 504 sit-in. Activists occupied federal buildings for weeks, demanding the government implement Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, a key anti-discrimination law.
Weeks, wow.
Yeah, it was the longest nonviolent occupation of a federal building in U.S. history, and it powerfully framed disability as a civil rights issue. Another iconic moment was the 1990 Capitol crawl. Activists got out of their wheelchairs and literally crawled up the steps of the U.S. Capitol.
I remember seeing pictures of that.
Right. A visceral symbol of the daily barriers they faced, demanding Congress pass the Americans with Disabilities Act.
And these actions, these sustained efforts, they led to real change, didn't they? What were the major legal victories?
They were huge. Landmark legislation came out of this. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, prohibiting discrimination by federally funded programs. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, now called IDEA, guaranteeing educational rights. And, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, in 1990. The world's first comprehensive civil rights law for people with disabilities covering employment, public services, accommodations.
So the big takeaway here isn't just about laws, is it? It's about who gets to define the experience.
Precisely. The disability rights movement was an epistemological revolution, really. It rejected the authority of doctors and experts to define disability from the outside. It asserted that disabled people themselves were the true experts on their own lives, their own experiences. A fundamental shift in power.
Okay, so we've covered the historical shifts, the legal battles, but our sources also really dive into the personal, the lived, the subjective experience of disability, which involves for many a pretty profound psychological journey, forming an identity in a world that often stigmatizes difference, like the onset or diagnosis of a disability. That can trigger a real crisis, can't it? Shock, denial, anger, grief. Those feelings are common. And that internal journey is made harder by external pressures, like pervasive stigma, which can lead to negative self-image, stress. Society often puts people into a sick role, viewing them with pity.
Absolutely. And a really pivotal part of adjusting, which our sources highlight, is forming a disability identity. This isn't passive, it's an active process. You have to incorporate disability into your sense of self, often confronting internalized ableism, those negative messages you've absorbed from society. It's about reclaiming it in a way.
What's really fascinating, though, is this idea our sources call the paradox of pride. Research suggests that experiencing oppression and stigma can actually fuel the development of a strong, positive identity, disability pride. How does that work?
It seems paradoxical, right? But it's a powerful psychological dynamic.
Yeah.
When you're faced with society devaluing you, you basically have a choice. You can internalize that negativity, which is incredibly damaging.
Right.
Or you can consciously reject it. You reframe disability not as shame, but as a source of pride, a core part of who you are. This proud identity becomes an act of resistance. It's a buffer against discrimination. And it's often nurtured through connecting with the wider disability community, finding strength in shared experience.
And it's crucial to remember, as the sources emphasize, that being disabled isn't a single issue thing. It always intersects with other parts of identity, race, gender, class, sexual orientation. Which brings us to intersectionality.
Right. Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black feminist legal scholar, developed this framework. Intersectionality basically says that systems of oppression like ableism, racism, sexism, they don't operate in isolation. They interlock, they weave together, and they create unique, compounded experiences of marginalization that are more than just adding up separate issues. The data really bears this out. Stark disparities. For instance, in the U.S., about 3 in 10 Native Americans have a disability. 1 in 4 Black people. Compare that to 1 in 5 white people. So people of color with disabilities often face what's called triple jeopardy. It leads to significantly worse outcomes. Poverty rates, for example, in 2019, the poverty rate for Black disabled adults was 28%. That's 10 points higher than for white disabled adults.
Wow.
And gender is another huge factor. Women and girls with disabilities face unique risks. greater barriers to education, employment, and most alarmingly, staggering rates of violence. Studies show they can experience up to 10 times more violence than non-disabled peers, nearly 3 times more likely to face sexual violence. It's appalling.
It really is. So if these oppressions are so tangled up, why do single-issue movements sometimes fall short? Why isn't tackling just ableism or just racism enough?
Because an intersectional lens shows they aren't just additive. They actually construct each other, reinforce each other. They create a qualitatively different kind of marginalization. Like activist Carrie Gray points out, if you're a Black disabled woman, you can't just split your experiences neatly between different groups. It doesn't work like that. A holistic intersectional approach is the only way to achieve real liberation, because you have to address how these systems work together. You can't fix inaccessible buildings without also addressing the racism someone might face trying to use them.
That makes so much sense, and our sources point to the disability arts and culture movement as a really powerful force here, both for individual identity and for collective political action.
Oh, absolutely. It's as vital. When disabled people create art, literature, performance, they seize control of their own narrative. They transform themselves from being just objects of medical talk or charity ads into subjects, people with agency, complexity, humanity. And this act of self-representation, it's inherently political. It functions as public pedagogy. It teaches society, offers alternative ways to understand disability. Plus, it fosters that crucial sense of community and pride needed to resist oppression and, really thrive.
Now, these ideas about identity, social construction, they have very real, very material consequences, especially in the economic and political lives of disabled people. Disability and poverty, the sources show, are locked in this vicious cycle.
Inextricably linked. Globally, people with disabilities are disproportionately poor. In the U.S., more than twice as likely to live in poverty as non-disabled folks. Labor force participation. For working-age adults with disabilities, it's less than half the rate of non-disabled adults. And the wage gap is significant. Disabled workers earned about 74 cents for every dollar paid to non-disabled workers back in 2020.
And it works both ways, right? Poverty increases disability risk, and disability increases poverty risk.
Exactly. It's bidirectional. Poverty ups the risk of acquiring a disability, lack of health care, unsafe conditions, etc. And having a disability increases the risk of falling into poverty, job loss, discrimination, plus huge extra costs for health care, assistive tech, accessible housing. And crucially, these disparities aren't because people don't want to work. They stem from systemic barriers. Pervasive employer discrimination is a big one. Inaccessible workplaces. And these benefits cliffs in systems like Medicaid or SSI, they can trap people. You earn a bit more money, maybe lose essential health coverage or housing support. It forces an impossible choice.
So just like exclusion from economic life, disabled people are also systematically underrepresented when it comes to political power.
That's right. Disabled citizens face all sorts of ableist barriers to just participating politically. Sometimes outright denial of voting rights for certain groups. Inaccessible polling stations are still a huge issue. Plus, the sheer cost of running an accessible campaign can be prohibitive. The result is a major deficit in descriptive representation. Simply put, not enough disabled people holding office worldwide.
And why does that lack of representation matter so much?
Because it has profound consequences for policy. Disabled politicians often bring what's called experiential representation. They draw on their unique lived insights to champion disability issues, to see problems others might miss. When they're absent, policies get designed without considering the needs and perspectives of a huge chunk of the population. Things get missed. People get left behind.
Another dimension of this exclusion, which really struck me in the sources, is the link between disability and environmental justice. That's not something you hear about every day.
It's critical, though. The disability community is disproportionately vulnerable to environmental problems, including climate change. During natural disasters, for example, their mortality rate is often 2 to 4 times higher than the non-disabled population.
2 to 4 times. Why?
Largely due to systemic neglect. Emergency plans often don't account for their needs. Warnings might be inaccessible. There's often inadequate support for people relying on power for medical equipment or who need specific evacuation assistance. Plus, think about exposure to pollution. Industrial sites are often located near lower-income communities, which, as we saw, have higher rates of disability, so they bear a double burden.
And there's this concept of eco-ableism, too.
Yeah, that's when well-intentioned environmental policies actually end up harming or excluding disabled people. Classic examples are things like banning plastic straws, which are essential medical devices for some people, or maybe removing disabled parking spots for bike lanes without providing accessible alternatives nearby. These actions, often done without consulting the disability community, just reinforce exclusion. Good intentions aren't enough if they create new barriers.
So bringing this all together, why is this exclusion economic, political, environmental? Why is it bad for everyone, not just disabled people?
That's the key question, right? And the sources offer a powerful answer. It's not just unjust to disabled individuals. It's actively detrimental to society as a whole. Disability justice advocates make this point really clearly. Disabled people are often experts in adaptation, creative problem-solving, resilience. Think about the skills needed to navigate an inaccessible world every day. Now, in an era facing huge challenges like climate change, challenges that demand exactly those skills, adaptation, resilience, creative thinking, excluding the knowledge and insights of disabled people, it's a massive strategic failure for all of us. We're basically handicapping ourselves by ignoring their expertise.
Okay, our deep dive has definitely laid out some major challenges. But let's shift focus now to solutions. How do we actually engineer a more inclusive future? The sources point strongly towards redesigning the environment itself. Which brings us to universal design. This seems like a really powerful tool for putting the social model into practice.
It really is. Universal design isn't just about adding accessibility features later. It's about designing products, environments, communications, so they're usable by everyone to the greatest extent possible right from the start without needing special adaptation. It's a fundamental shift. Moving from reactive accommodations, fixing problems after they exist, to proactive inclusivity baked in from the beginning.
What are the core ideas behind it?
It's guided by 7 main principles. Things like equitable use, useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. Flexibility in use accommodates a wide range of preferences and abilities. Simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and adequate size and space for approach and use. The real magic, though, the bit that often clicks for people, is that it benefits everyone. Think about curb cuts and sidewalks, essential for wheelchair users, sure, but also super helpful for parents with strollers, travelers with rolling luggage, kids on bikes, delivery people.
Right, I use them all the time without thinking.
Exactly. Automatic doors, lever-style door handles instead of fiddly knobs, video captions. These are all examples of universal design that make things easier for a huge range of people, disabled or not, often in ways we don't even notice.
So universal design tackles the environment, but there's also assistive technology, AT, focused on enhancing individual function. And it sounds like AT is undergoing a massive transformation thanks to tech advancements.
Oh, definitely. The pace of change is incredible. Key trends. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are huge. They're powering much better screen readers, real-time captioning that's getting very accurate, personalized speech recognition like Google's Lookout app or Project Relate. The Internet of Things is enabling smart homes, which can drastically increase independence for people with mobility impairments, controlling lights, temperature, doors with voice or apps, wearable tech, robotics, exoskeletons. They're offering new kinds of support, movement control. And then there are brain-computer interfaces, BCIs, which are still early days but offer the potential to control devices purely with thought. It's sci-fi becoming reality.
It really is. Which leads to some pretty deep questions, doesn't it? Especially with this increasing integration of tech with the human body cybernetics. Does focusing on technologically fixing or upgrading the body risk reinforcing those old medical model ideas?
That's the heart of a major debate in disability studies, and it's where things get really interesting and ethically complex. On one hand, advanced prosthetics, cochlear implants, things like that, can be incredibly empowering, vastly improving quality of life for many, no question. But on the other hand, this intense focus on using technology to fix or normalize impairment. You can see how it could be viewed as just a high-tech version of the medical model's desire to eliminate difference. It creates this dilemma. Does pursuing a tech cure inadvertently reinforce the ableist notion that a disabled body is inherently flawed and needs correction, rather than being accepted as a valid part of human variation? It's a real tension.
And beyond the philosophical questions, there are practical ethical concerns too, right? Like the digital divide.
Absolutely critical. As technology becomes more essential for participation in society work, education, healthcare, what happens to those who can't afford these often expensive tools? Or who live in areas without the necessary internet infrastructure? There's a huge risk of creating an even wider gap, leaving people further behind. And then there's data privacy. These technologies often collect vast amounts of very personal data, health metrics, activity levels, maybe even brain activity with BCIs. Who owns that data? How is it secured? What about consent? The potential for misuse or discrimination based on this data is immense.
So this technological frontier It's a real crossroads.
It really is. These powerful tools could either push us towards the social model, creating a genuinely more accessible world for all, or they could double down on the medical model, focusing energy on fixing individuals so they can fit into a world that remains fundamentally unchanged and inaccessible. The choices society makes about developing and deploying these technologies will tell us a lot about our deepest beliefs about human difference.
So building an inclusive future isn't just about gadgets and design. It requires fundamentally rethinking our social systems too. Education, rehabilitation, even our basic ethical frameworks.
Exactly. In education, for example, there's a needed paradigm shift. Moving away from seeing special education as a separate place students are sent to, instead seeing it as a service that supports students within mainstream, inclusive classrooms whenever possible. This means curricula that actually teach about disability history and rights, maybe ability awareness workshops for all students, integrated play, breaking down biases early. And for rehabilitation, there's a model called community-based rehabilitation, CBR, developed by the WHO. It's a powerful alternative to relying solely on large, often inaccessible institutions. It focuses on empowering local communities to provide holistic support. It has 5 pillars: health, education, livelihood, social inclusion, and empowerment. It aligns much better with the social and biopsychosocial models support rooted in the community.
Okay, but perhaps the most profound, maybe most challenging ethical frontier comes from advances in genetic science. The sources talk about the specter of a new eugenics. What does that mean?
It's a serious concern. Technologies like sophisticated prenatal genetic screening and potentially gene editing technologies like CRISPR raise the possibility of a new eugenics. This wouldn't necessarily be state-mandated like the old eugenics. It could operate through millions of private, individual reproductive choices.
How so?
Well, the dilemmas are huge. There's the potential social pressure on prospective parents to terminate pregnancies if a screening detects a disability. The risk of genetic discrimination will insurers or employers demand genetic information. But most critically, the very drive to eliminate disability at the genetic level. It implicitly reinforces that ableist assumption that disabled lives are inherently less valuable, less worth living. This stands in direct opposition to the affirmation model, to disability pride, to the whole disability justice movement, which says difference is valuable.
So this ethical debate around genetics, it really feels like the ultimate battleground, doesn't it? Between the medical model wanting to eliminate perceived flaws and the social affirmation models embracing human diversity.
Absolutely. How society navigates this ethical minefield, the debates we have, the regulations we put in place, the choices we make, this will be perhaps the clearest indicator of our core beliefs about disability and ultimately about the value of human difference itself.
So we've journeyed through these evolving definitions of disability, faced some really dark history, explored the complex reality of lived experience, and looked at the tech and ethical frontiers ahead.
And ultimately, what this deep dive suggests is that a true science of human disabilities, it's not really about studying deficient bodies like the old medical model thought. Its real purpose is to be a critical social science. Its job is to deconstruct the political forces, the cultural biases, the economic systems that create exclusion. And then, to provide the evidence, the frameworks, the tools needed to build a genuinely more just and equitable world. It's fundamentally a science of social analysis and social change. A truly proper human culture, as one source puts it, wouldn't just tolerate difference. It would build its governance systems on disability justice principles. It would ensure experiential representation, people with lived experience at all levels of decision-making. It would bake universal design and intersectional thinking into all policy right from the start.
You know, we often wonder why humans seem prone to breaking rules or even trying to wipe out other cultures or ways of life. This deep dive offers a compelling argument. Maybe that destructive tendency stems from rigidly constructing normalcy and then fearing anything perceived as abnormal.
And the counterpoint, the insight for building a better future, is that a healthy, prosperous, truly balanced society isn't one that achieves perfect conformity. It's not about everyone being the same, quite the opposite. It's one that actively dismantles that architecture of normalcy, that replaces fear of difference with a genuine embrace of diversity in all its forms. The ultimate goal, then, isn't really to eliminate disability. It's to eliminate ableism.
So a truly advanced, maybe even prosperous culture would recognize human variation not as a flaw needing correction, but as a fundamental source of strength. Like biodiversity for an ecosystem, human diversity brings creativity, resilience, new perspectives. It would mean shifting our core values, perhaps away from just celebrating rugged individualism towards appreciating our deep interdependence. In a culture like that, the very concept of disability as a category that excludes people, it might just wither away. Not because all impairments were magically cured, but because the environment, physical, social, attitudinal, would finally be built to welcome and support the full, complex, beautiful spectrum of human diversity. So after all that, what stands out most to you from this deep dive? How might this shift your perspective on human difference and how we ought to build our world? We really hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights to chew on. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
This is DigitView.